In the soft twilight of the North Atlantic, there once stood a quiet island, wrapped in mist and shaped by endless waves. Britain, in the early centuries, was not yet the powerful name the world would someday know. It was simply a cluster of green lands, calm rivers, and small villages where life moved slowly, almost rhythmically with the turning of the seasons. People farmed their fields, tended sheep on rolling hills, and gathered around wooden hearths as cold winds brushed against the stone walls of their homes. Yet even in this peaceful simplicity, something subtle was changing. The island had always looked outward. Fishermen learned to trust the distant horizon. Sailors mapped new currents. Traders carried wool, tin, and stories from faraway ports. Little by little, this curiosity became a quiet force, soft but persistent, like a tide returning again and again to the same shore. Britain was small, yet its dreams were not. In dimly lit taverns near the coast, captains spoke of lands beyond the sunrise. In universities and old libraries, scholars discussed ancient texts describing distant kingdoms. And in the minds of ordinary people, a question slowly took shape. What lies beyond our seas? What might we discover if we follow the winds farther than before? No one knew it then, but these whispers, these gentle sparks of imagination, would grow into something far greater. They would guide explorers across oceans, inspire merchants to build new networks, and eventually shape the destiny of a quarter of the world. But those grand stories would come later. For now, the British Empire began not with noise or conquest, but with quiet dreams, simple, steady, and deeply human. Dreams born on a peaceful island where the waves never stopped calling. And tonight, as you listen, let your own thoughts drift like those early ships, moving calmly across silent waters. If you'd like more gentle stories like this, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribe, rest, and let history guide you into sleep. The story of Britain's earliest steps toward expansion begins long before it ever imagined ruling distant lands. In the quiet centuries after the medieval period, Britain was still a modest island kingdom shaped by farms, fisheries, and simple trade. Life was slow, familiar, and tied to the rhythms of nature. Yet the world outside was changing, and Britain, almost without noticing, began to change with it. At the heart of these gradual shifts stood something simple, the wooden ship. Wooden ships had always been part of life on the island. Fishermen leaned on them to gather food from nearby waters, merchants depended on them to move wool and metal across the channel, and coastal communities relied on them to stay connected with neighboring lands. But over time, these ships quietly began to evolve. Stronger hulls, better sails, sturdier masts, and more reliable navigation tools allowed sailors to travel farther than their parents and grandparents ever had. Nothing about these changes was sudden. They were small improvements made year after year, each one adding a little more confidence to Britain's relationship with the sea. As ships improved, knowledge about the ocean expanded too. Sailors began keeping detailed notes about winds, currents, and stars. They shared stories in taverns, on docks, and in quiet villages, slowly building a shared understanding of how the Atlantic breathed and moved. This knowledge did not guarantee safety, but it reduced the fear of the unknown. The horizon no longer felt like a hard boundary. It became an invitation. During this time, Europe was entering an age of exploration. Spain and Portugal had already begun sailing far beyond the known world. They returned with spices, silver, and stories of lands that seemed almost unreal to those who heard about them. Britain did not immediately join this race. It watched from a distance, still focused on its own shores. But curiosity has a way of spreading, and the tales of foreign treasures, new trade routes, and unseen territories quietly stirred the imagination of British sailors, merchants, and adventurers. The island's early rulers began to see the sea not just as a barrier, but as a pathway. They encouraged exploration in small ways, supporting maps, sponsoring occasional voyages, and inviting skilled shipbuilders to improve naval designs. The British Navy was not yet a global force, but its foundations were being laid in these steady years of observation, learning, and slow development.
Meanwhile, merchants saw opportunity. Britain's economy depended heavily on trading wool, but wool alone could not satisfy a growing population. Merchants wanted new goods, new markets, and new connections across the ocean. They began considering longer routes that would take them past familiar coastlines into waters that felt wider, deeper, and more mysterious. At first, only a few brave captains attempted such journeys. Their ships were small, their crews limited, and their supplies uncertain. But each voyage brought back something valuable, even if it was simply a new understanding of winds or the shape of a distant coastline. These small steps gradually built confidence. One of the early motivations for long voyages came from fishing. The waters near Britain were rich but limited. As demand grew, fishermen ventured farther into the Atlantic to seek new grounds. They discovered the fertile waters near Newfoundland, where fish were abundant. These fishing expeditions required longer journeys, stronger ships, and better planning. And through these voyages, Britain learned how to survive on the open ocean for extended periods. This knowledge would later support much greater ambitions. But expansion wasn't only about fishing or trade. It was about understanding that the world was far larger than previously imagined. New maps began appearing, first rough and uncertain, then gradually more accurate. Sailors learned from each other's mistakes, refining routes and correcting earlier assumptions. These maps gave people a sense of direction, encouraging them to push further. The earliest British explorers were not grand figures seeking empire. They were practical men driven by necessity and curiosity. Many of their journeys ended quietly, with little success or reward. But each small attempt contributed to a much larger transformation. Exploration was becoming part of the British mindset. The island no longer looked inward. It began to face the sea with intention. Still, expansion required more than ships. It required a system to support long-distance travel. Ports like Bristol, Plymouth, and London expanded their docks. Warehouse storage increased. Rope makers, sail makers, and carpenters found steady employment. Coastal towns grew busier. Ships needed supplies, sailors needed training, and merchants needed financial backing. All of this created a network that made longer voyages possible.
It was during this period that the concept of overseas trade companies began to form. Merchants realized that long voyages were expensive, risky, and unpredictable. By pooling money together, they could share the risks and rewards. This idea, simple but effective, planted the seed for what would later become powerful trade organizations. These early partnerships financed expeditions to explore new markets, new shorelines, and new possibilities. The first steps of expansion were not grand or heroic. They were quiet, uncertain, and often overlooked in their own time. But they were essential. Step by step, Britain learned how to build ships that could travel across oceans, navigate storms, and return home with valuable cargo. Step by step, it learned how to manage long voyages, communicate across distances, and maintain supply chains. And step by step, it developed the confidence required to push beyond familiar waters. Another important influence was Britain's geographic position. Being an island meant that the sea was always present, sometimes as a challenge, sometimes as a shelter, but always as a reminder that the world was vast. Unlike continental powers that focused on land-based expansion, Britain naturally gravitated toward the ocean. Even before empire was a possibility, the English coastline shaped the nation's character. Ports became gateways, sailors became storytellers, and the waves quietly shaped British identity. As Britain grew more comfortable with long-distance travel, it began forming early relationships with coastal regions in Africa and the Americas. These early interactions were small in scale, trading goods, collecting resources, and mapping coastlines. There was no unified imperial strategy. There were simply opportunities that merchants, sailors, and adventurers pursued one at a time. Over the next century, competition played a major role. Other European powers were moving fast. Spain controlled large parts of the Americas. Portugal dominated trade routes across Africa and Asia. France and the Netherlands were strengthening their fleets. Britain realized that hesitation could mean falling behind. And though Britain did not yet have the strongest navy or the richest treasury, it did have ambition, growing maritime skills, and a willingness to learn. As a result, British voyages slowly extended farther. Ships began crossing the Atlantic more regularly. Settlement attempts were made in the Americas, some failing, others surviving. These early settlements were small, fragile, and often struggling for supplies, yet they marked the beginning of Britain's physical presence beyond Europe. Back at home, the growth of navigation tools brought confidence. The development of better compasses, improved understanding of latitude, and more accurate timekeeping helped sailors guide their ships more reliably. These inventions did not eliminate danger, but they reduced uncertainty. Journeys became smoother, and death at sea became slightly less common. Another element behind Britain's expanding horizons was the slow but steady improvement of naval strategy. Early naval leaders recognized that protecting trade routes was essential. Pirates, storms, and rival nations posed constant threats, so Britain invested in better warships, training programs, and systems of communication. The Navy began escorting merchant ships, ensuring safer travel. This cooperation between merchants and the Navy became a defining feature of Britain's expansion. The role of religion also played a quiet part. Missionaries traveled along with sailors, believing it was their duty to spread their faith. While their influence was small in the early years, they helped establish cultural contact with local communities across distant shores. Their journals, often detailed and descriptive, provided early accounts of lands Britain barely understood. As Britain's presence around the world grew, small trade posts gradually formed. These were not yet colonies, but simple stations used for rest, storage, and exchange. They acted as stepping stones, giving British ships spaces to repair, gather supplies, and prepare for longer journeys. These posts were often built through agreements with local leaders, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, but they allowed Britain to maintain a foothold in distant regions. Economically, these early steps brought modest but steady profits. Imported goods such as sugar, tobacco, and spices began appearing in British markets. These luxuries attracted more investors, more merchants, and more ships. The cycle continued. The more profitable the voyages became, the more people wanted to participate. But it is important to remember that Britain's early expansion was not a clean, smooth process. It involved hardships, shipwrecks, disease, conflict, and failure. Many journeys never returned, many settlements collapsed, and many attempts left no lasting impact. Yet Britain persisted. Its willingness to try again, to rebuild, and to learn from mistakes was one of the key factors behind its gradual rise. By the time Britain fully entered the global stage, it had already developed centuries of seafaring experience. Its wooden ships, once simple fishing vessels, had become symbols of possibility. They carried goods, knowledge, people, stories, and ambitions across oceans. They connected a small island to distant horizons and opened the door to an era that would reshape the world. These were the first steps of expansion, slow, uncertain, and often quiet, but they marked the beginning of a journey that would lead Britain far beyond anything its earliest sailors could have imagined. What started with wooden ships hugging familiar coastlines eventually evolved into long voyages reaching the edges of the known world. And though the empire would grow much larger in the centuries to come, its foundations were built here, in the steady determination of sailors, the curiosity of merchants, and the quiet courage of an island that learned to trust the horizon. The rise of British influence across the world did not begin with sudden conquest or loud declarations. It began with something quieter, almost ordinary, the establishment of small trading posts along distant coasts. These posts did not look like the centers of a future empire. They were simple wooden structures, modest warehouses, stone forts, and small clusters of houses. Yet these places slowly became the backbone of Britain's influence abroad. To understand how this happened, we must return to a time when oceans were slowly becoming highways of opportunity. Britain, having improved its ships and navigation, had begun to sail farther. At first, these journeys were cautious. Sailors hugged familiar coasts, stopping frequently for water, food, and repairs. But as confidence grew, voyages extended. The Atlantic, once intimidating, became a familiar companion. Across calm seas, British ships carried not only goods, but also the quiet ambitions of merchants who were learning how global trade worked. In these early years, Britain did not seek to conquer, it sought to trade, and trade required stable places to anchor, rest, and store goods. So the idea of the trading post emerged naturally. These posts were small outposts in foreign lands, created to support long-distance commerce. They allowed ships to unload cargo, repair sails, rest crews, and gather information about local markets. The first British trading posts appeared in locations where European ships already operated. West Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of the Indian Ocean saw early British activity. On these shores, merchants negotiated with local rulers, offering items such as guns, cloth, metal, and manufactured goods in exchange for gold, spices, or other valuable resources. These exchanges were often simple and straightforward. There was no fixed plan for domination. The focus was purely economic. But trade has a way of growing. A post that began as a small warehouse often expanded into a settlement. A few merchants grew into dozens. A handful of ships turned into regular traffic. Slowly, the British presence became more visible. This slow, steady growth created a web of influence that stretched across regions without the need for armies. One of the most important aspects of these trading posts was their location. British merchants carefully selected sites that offered sheltered waters, nearby resources, and cooperation from local leaders. Some posts were built on islands where control was easier. Others were placed on riverbanks, giving access to inland communities. Over time, these locations became familiar to British sailors who navigated calm seas to reach them.
Calm seas played a significant role in the growth of British influence. Unlike the unpredictable storms of the North Atlantic, many of the waters near Africa and Asia offered smoother sailing during certain seasons. This stability allowed regular trade routes to develop. Ships could plan their journeys knowing they would reach their destinations with fewer risks. Calm seas also encouraged more merchants to join the trade, increasing traffic and deepening Britain's presence in each region. Inside these trading posts, life moved at its own pace. Merchants kept records of prices, goods, and local customs. They studied market trends, learned basic words of local languages, and built relationships with community leaders.
In many places, British traders were seen not as conquerors, but as visitors who brought goods and opportunities. This perception helped Britain maintain peaceful relations, at least in the early stages. As trading posts grew, so did the need for administration. Merchants created councils to manage disputes, protect property, and regulate trade. These councils were not governments, but they acted as early forms of local authority. They set rules for behavior, prices, and interactions with local communities. Over time, these councils became more structured, and some trading posts developed their own self-governing systems. One of the most influential trading posts was located in India. At first, British merchants visited coastal cities simply to buy spices, textiles, and other goods. But competition between European powers made control over trade more important. To secure their position, the British established fortified posts known as factories in key regions. These factories were not places of manufacturing, they were centers of commerce, equipped with storage rooms, living quarters, and defensive walls. The East India Company managed these posts, coordinating trade and negotiating with local rulers. The company's influence expanded gradually. It started with agreements, treaties, and licenses granted by local kings. These agreements allowed the British to trade freely, build warehouses, and sometimes maintain small military guards. No one at the time imagined that these simple permissions would one day evolve into full territorial control. The process was too slow, too quiet, too subtle. It did not resemble a takeover, it felt like ordinary commerce. A similar pattern unfolded elsewhere. In Africa, trading posts served as points of exchange for gold, ivory, and other valuable goods. Local rulers often welcomed the trade, seeing it as an opportunity to access foreign products. The British presence remained small but consistent. Influence grew not through force, but through familiarity. People began to rely on these exchanges, creating a kind of economic bond. In the Caribbean, British trading posts became centers for the sugar trade. The warm climate allowed the cultivation of sugarcane, and British merchants saw the potential for profit. Early settlements in the region were fragile, facing challenges such as disease, storms, and conflict. But over time, these outposts grew stronger. Calm seas during certain months helped maintain steady trade routes between the Caribbean and Britain. Sugar began flowing into British ports, supporting industries and increasing wealth.
Despite these successes, life at a trading post was not easy. Merchants faced unfamiliar climates, diseases, and shortages of supplies. Communication with Britain took months, sometimes longer. Decisions had to be made with limited information. Even so, merchants adapted. They learned to negotiate with local leaders, resolve disputes, and manage the complex flows of goods. The slow rise of British influence through trading posts also depended on cooperation. In many regions, the British relied on local people for labor, transport, and guidance. Relationships with local communities shaped the success of each post. Cultural exchange became common. British traders adopted local customs, food, and clothing. They formed friendships, business partnerships, and sometimes families across cultural lines. These relationships made British presence feel less foreign and more integrated. As time passed, the trading posts became nodes in a larger network of global commerce. Ships sailed from Britain to Africa, from Africa to the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean back to Britain. This triangular pattern of trade created steady movement across the Atlantic. Goods flowed along predictable routes, and each region became part of a larger economic system. Though this system later grew into something darker and more complex, its earliest form was driven by simple trade and the desire for profit. In Asia, the British presence deepened as well. The calm seas of the Indian Ocean provided stable pathways for merchants. From India, British ships traded with Southeast Asia, China, and the Middle East. The variety of goods available, from spices and textiles to tea and porcelain, encouraged more merchants to join the trade.
Over time, British trading posts became some of the busiest hubs in the region. The slow rise of influence also came from learning. British merchants became students of the regions they worked in. They studied monsoons, memorized coastlines, and mastered local trade customs. Their journals recorded everything from wind directions to social etiquette. These records were shared back in Britain, helping future voyages become more predictable. Knowledge became as valuable as cargo. Another factor behind Britain's growing influence was organization. Many trading posts operated under the leadership of companies like the East India Company or the Royal African Company. These companies were supported by investors, making long voyages financially possible. They created standardized procedures, set expectations, and ensured regular shipments. This organization gave Britain an advantage over smaller, less coordinated traders. Meanwhile, Britain's navy played a quiet supporting role. Though not yet the most powerful navy in the world, it protected merchant ships and patrolled important trade routes. The presence of naval escorts reassured merchants and deterred piracy. This cooperation between commerce and military support helped strengthen Britain's position across regions. Throughout this period, Britain's influence grew without drawing too much attention. Other European powers, occupied with their own ambitions, did not always notice the gradual expansion of British activity. Many assumed Britain was simply participating in trade like the rest. But behind this modest appearance, Britain was building a system that would eventually support imperial rule. The growth of trading posts also changed life in Britain. New goods became part of daily routines. Tea, once a luxury, slowly became a common drink. Sugar sweetened food and influenced culture. Spices changed cooking habits. Textiles introduced new fashions. The British people may not have known the details of distant trading posts, but they enjoyed the results of those quiet exchanges. What made this rise of influence especially powerful was its subtlety. Because it did not rely on large armies or major conquests, it did not provoke immediate resistance. Local communities often saw British traders as partners rather than invaders. Over decades, this created trust, or at least acceptance. Influence was built not through domination, but through dependency and cooperation. Yet there were tensions. Misunderstandings occurred. Contracts were disputed. Cultural differences created friction. But most of these issues were resolved locally, without large-scale conflict. The trading posts served as bridges between worlds, places where negotiation, communication, and adaptation shaped outcomes. By the time Britain entered the 18th century, its network of trading posts had become deeply rooted. They stretched from West Africa to the Indian subcontinent, from the Caribbean to the edges of Southeast Asia. These posts allowed Britain to move goods efficiently, gather information, and build relationships. They also served as launching points for future expansion. Looking back, it becomes clear that Britain's global influence was built not in a single moment, but over many decades of patient development. A warehouse built on a foreign shore did not look like a foundation of empire. A small group of merchants did not look like future administrators of vast territories. But these humble beginnings laid the groundwork. The calm seas that carried British ships helped create stability. The trading posts that supplied them created footholds, and the slow rise of influence through trade shaped the early character of British expansion: quiet, practical, and deeply connected to economic opportunity. In these early years, no one knew how far this network would eventually reach. No one imagined that these small posts would someday become major colonial centers. No one predicted that a nation trading simple goods would one day influence the lives of millions across the globe. But this is how empires begin, not with sudden transformation, but with slow steps taken across calm seas, guided by curiosity, ambition, and the pursuit of opportunity. And so, from modest trading posts and peaceful waters, Britain began weaving the first threads of a global presence that would later reshape world history. These early stages were quiet, steady, and unremarkable in their own time, yet they marked the beginning of something far larger than anyone could have imagined. The story of the East India Company begins in an England that was still learning how to look beyond its borders. Britain had developed trading posts across various coasts, and merchants were growing more confident with each passing year. But one thing was becoming clear: long-distance trade required organization. It required structure, planning, and collective investment. No single merchant could carry such a burden alone. And so, at the close of the 16th century, a group of English merchants gathered in London to discuss an idea. They wanted a unified company that could manage trade with the East, particularly India and the surrounding regions, which were known for their spices, textiles, precious stones, and other goods unfamiliar to Europe. After months of negotiation, they approached the Queen. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted them a royal charter. This charter created a new organization, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies, soon known simply as the East India Company. At the time of its formation, no one imagined what it would become. It began as a business venture, nothing more. Its goal was simple: buy goods from Asia at reasonable prices and sell them in Europe at a profit. The company was given permission to trade, negotiate, and defend itself if necessary, but not to rule. Its founding merchants were not soldiers, not administrators, and certainly not dreamers of empire. They were businessmen following opportunity. The first ships set sail in simple fashion. Their journeys were long and uncertain. Crews faced storms, disease, and unfamiliar waters. Many voyages ended in loss, yet some succeeded, bringing back pepper, clothes, and fine cloth that European markets eagerly purchased. These early profits encouraged further investment, and the company slowly expanded. When the company arrived in India, it found a land rich in culture, tradition, and trade. The Mughal Empire, which governed much of the region, was one of the wealthiest states in the world. Its cities were vibrant, its markets active, and its administration sophisticated. The British traders entered quietly, showing no sign of ambition beyond commerce. They requested permission to set up small trading stations, known as factories, in coastal towns. The Mughal rulers allowed this, seeing the company as a harmless group of foreign merchants who could bring silver and goods in exchange for local textiles and produce. The company built its first factories in places such as Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. These were not industrial factories. They were warehouses, offices, and small settlements where company officials lived and worked. Life in these early outposts was simple. Merchants negotiated prices, inspected goods, paid local taxes, and documented everything. They lived in modest buildings, ate local food, and learned how to communicate with Indian traders. The company depended heavily on local knowledge. Indian weavers produced the textiles, Indian brokers arranged shipments, Indian laborers handled goods, and Indian officials oversaw the laws. The company was just one participant in a vast economic landscape. But over time, something subtle happened. The company began to grow, not through force, but through need. Trade expanded, more ships arrived, and the company required additional space and staff. Local suppliers began producing goods specifically for British merchants. Ports grew busier, new settlements emerged around company posts. The British presence, though small, became a familiar part of the coastal economy. The company learned that in order to protect its interests, it needed some form of security. Rival European powers, French, Dutch, and Portuguese traders, were also active in India. Competition sometimes led to conflict. To defend its warehouses and supplies, the company hired small groups of guards. These guards were not part of a grand army.
They were local men trained to protect property. But even this minor step began shaping the company's future. As competition increased, so did the company's need for political relationships. Merchant activity required stability. Trade could not flourish in chaos, so the company began negotiating treaties with local rulers. Some treaties granted the company tax exemptions. Others provided land for warehouses. Some promised protection for caravans. Each agreement, while small, strengthened the company's position. But none of this looked like empire, at least not yet. During the 17th and 18th centuries, India's political landscape slowly changed. The Mughal Empire, once powerful, began to weaken. Local rulers gained more autonomy. Conflicts between kingdoms became more frequent. As uncertainty grew, merchants faced challenges. Trade routes became less safe, taxes fluctuated, agreements were broken during conflicts. The company realized that depending entirely on local rulers made business risky. To secure its operations, it expanded its private forces. At first, these forces were small, but as the company acquired more land and more privileges, the number grew. By the early 18th century, the company maintained not just guards, but trained soldiers, many of them Indian, commanded by British officers. Still, the company's goal remained trade. It did not seek political control, but circumstances slowly reshaped its role. A turning point came in the mid-18th century. Rivalries between local Indian rulers often brought European companies into conflict. The British and French companies supported different factions, hoping to gain trading advantage. These struggles escalated into open battles, such as the Carnatic Wars in South India. The British company, better funded and better organized, emerged stronger. One event, however, changed everything: the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The company's forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal with the help of local allies. Bengal was one of the richest regions in India. After the battle, the company gained not only trading privileges, but also administrative rights. It could now collect taxes, maintain law and order, and manage the region's revenue. This shift was unprecedented. A trading company had suddenly become a governing authority. But the company did not plan this outcome. It simply took advantage of opportunities that arose during instability. Its intention had always been profit through trade, not political power. Yet the responsibilities of governance kept expanding. To maintain control, the company needed a larger army. To fund the army, it needed revenue. And to secure revenue, it needed administrative structure. So, step by step, the company built the machinery of a state: courts, tax offices, laws, and bureaucracies. These institutions were not efficient at first. They evolved slowly, often through trial and error. This transformation did not happen through loud announcements. It happened quietly, through paperwork, negotiations, and practical decisions. A merchant company was becoming a political entity, almost without declaring it. Influence grew through contracts, alliances, and economic dependencies. People who lived under the company's territories slowly realized that decisions affecting their lives were being made not by local kings, but by distant officials operating under a flag of trade. The company's settlements grew into full towns. Forts expanded into administrative centers. Local elites began working closely with company officers. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed the backbone of the company's military strength. They trained, marched, and fought under British command, shaping one of the largest private armies in the world. The company's relationship with India was complex. It relied heavily on Indian merchants, weavers, bankers, and administrators. The Indian economy supplied textiles, indigo, tea, opium, and other goods that the company exported worldwide. At the same time, the company enforced policies that prioritized its profits. Taxes increased in some areas. Local industries faced challenges due to global competition. Many regions prospered, while others struggled. All of this happened gradually, and because the company's power expanded slowly, it often went unnoticed by the people far away in Britain. Many investors saw the company simply as a successful business bringing wealth into the country. They did not realize how deeply it had embedded itself into India's political structure. Meanwhile, in India, the company continued to expand its territory, again, usually not through aggressive conquest, but through treaties, alliances, and the need to protect trade routes. When conflicts did arise, the company's army intervened. Each intervention brought more land under its control. The company justified these actions as necessary for stability, commerce, and safety. By the late 18th century, the company governed vast regions of India. It administered laws, collected taxes, maintained armies, and controlled ports. It issued regulations that shaped daily life for millions of people. It negotiated with kings, defeated rivals, and influenced regional politics. Yet technically, it was still a private company, a group of merchants acting under a royal charter. This unusual situation created a quiet, unplanned empire. Unlike the Spanish or Portuguese empires, which were established through clear royal direction, the British presence in India grew through the decisions of a business organization. There was no grand strategy, no master plan, just a slow accumulation of power through necessity, opportunity, and circumstance. By this time, the company's influence extended beyond India. It traded in China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. It controlled key ports, maintained fleets, and managed diplomatic relationships. But India remained its centerpiece, its largest source of wealth, manpower, and administrative power. The world began to take notice. Other European powers were surprised by how a simple company had become a major territorial authority. Some envied its success, others feared its reach. In Britain, debates grew. Some believed the company was doing valuable work. Others criticized its power and the impact of its policies on India. Eventually, the British government stepped in to regulate the company more closely. Laws were passed to supervise its administration, limit corruption, and ensure accountability. But even with government oversight, the company continued to function as a ruler. Its officials traveled between London and India. Its armies expanded. Its bureaucracy became more complex. Its decisions shaped the social and economic life of millions. By the early 19th century, the company controlled most of India. It had become something no one originally imagined, a silent empire operating under the name of trade. It did not look like traditional empire building. There were no early declarations of sovereignty, no dramatic expansions, only gradual shifts, small agreements, local conflicts, and administrative adjustments that together formed a massive political structure. This empire was characterized by paperwork rather than proclamations, trade reports rather than royal speeches, and contracts rather than conquests. Yet its power was undeniable. It shaped borders, influenced cultures, and impacted global trade. Eventually, the company's rule came to an end in 1858 after a major uprising in India. The British government took direct control, dissolving the company's political authority. But by then, the foundations of the British Raj were already in place. Foundations built slowly, silently, and unexpectedly by a company that had once aimed only to trade. The rise of the East India Company is a reminder that empires do not always begin with ambition. Sometimes they begin with simple commerce, grow through necessity, and solidify through quiet influence. The company did not set out to rule, but circumstances pushed it deeper into power. Its story is one of gradual transformation, a merchant venture becoming, step by step, a silent empire. Today, the company no longer exists as an institution, but its impact remains deeply woven into the history of India, Britain, and the wider world. Its legacy is one of complexity, economic innovation, cultural exchange, political control, and transformation of global trade. And it all began with merchants, ships, and the simple idea of buying and selling goods across the sea. The formation of British colonies began not with grand cities or detailed plans, but with small settlements that grew slowly, shaped by trade, need, and the steady movement of ships across the oceans. These early settlements were simple places, clusters of wooden houses, a few warehouses, open markets, and the sound of waves meeting unfamiliar shores. Yet over time, they became important links in a network that connected distant regions of the world. To understand how colonies took shape, it is helpful to return to the period when the East India Company and other trading groups were expanding their reach. Britain was learning how to operate far from home. Trading posts had already been built, and merchants had become familiar with new coasts and climates. But trade alone was not enough. People began to settle near these posts, either because trade required longer stays or because new opportunities encouraged them to remain. Settlements formed naturally, often without anyone planning for them to become permanent. In North America, the earliest British colonies began as experiments. Groups of settlers crossed the Atlantic hoping for better lives, new resources, and land to cultivate. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was one of the first. It started as a small, vulnerable outpost surrounded by forests and rivers. Survival was difficult. The settlers faced hunger, disease, and uncertainty. They depended on local indigenous communities for guidance and trade. Nothing about Jamestown suggested that it would later become part of a vast colonial structure. But as years passed, the settlement grew. More ships arrived, more families joined. Houses became sturdier, crops more reliable, and trade with Britain more organized. The colony developed laws, councils, and routines. What started as a fragile outpost slowly became a functioning community connected to the economy of the homeland. Other colonies followed. In New England, people formed settlements based on religious ideals, seeking a place where they could live according to their beliefs. These communities built towns with meeting houses, farms, and small marketplaces. Life there was simple but structured, shaped by cooperation and a shared desire for stability. Over time, these communities expanded into villages and towns, each linked through trade and shared culture. In the Caribbean, British settlements grew around agriculture. The warm climate supported crops like sugarcane, which became one of the most important commodities of the time. Small farming settlements turned into plantations, and trade routes carried sugar back to Britain. Ports developed around this activity, filled with ships loading and unloading goods. These islands became essential parts of Britain's commercial network, contributing to the country's rising wealth. In Africa, settlements were often small trading centers located near coasts. They served as points of exchange between British merchants and local communities. Goods such as ivory, gold, and agricultural products moved through these settlements. They did not resemble large colonies, but played important roles in trade. Each post became a familiar stop for British sailors, keeping the connection between continents active. In India, settlements grew around the East India Company's factories. What began as simple trading warehouses slowly expanded into towns like Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These places attracted merchants, laborers, craftsmen, and administrators. Over time, a distinct blend of cultures emerged, local traditions combined with British ways of governance and trade. Streets filled with markets, workshops, and homes. Officers lived near merchants, and the sound of ships arriving and departing became part of daily life. These settlements became important hubs for regional trade, gradually turning into major cities. Across all these regions, the process of forming colonies was gradual. No one simply arrived and announced that a colony existed. It happened through everyday activities, building homes, farming land, organizing trade, and developing rules. As more people settled, more structures appeared. Small clusters of houses became neighborhoods. Paths became roads. Markets expanded. Schools and churches were built. Each new addition made the settlements feel more permanent. As settlements strengthened, they began linking with one another. Ships traveled between colonies, carrying goods from one region to another before returning to Britain. A ship might leave London, stop in West Africa for supplies, sail to the Caribbean for sugar, then travel to the American colonies before heading home. These routes created a web of travel and exchange. Goods, ideas, and people moved along these pathways, weaving together regions that had once been far apart. The British government took interest in these developments. At first, it watched from a distance, allowing merchants and settlers to manage themselves. But as colonies became more important economically, Britain began to establish formal oversight. Governors were appointed, laws were introduced. Trade regulations shaped how goods moved across the empire. But even with this oversight, local communities retained certain freedoms, especially in the early years. Settlers handled daily governance, while Britain focused on maintaining broader control. One of the reasons colonies developed successfully was adaptation. Settlers learned to use local resources, climates, and conditions. They adopted new agricultural methods, built homes suited to the environment, and worked with local populations. In many cases, indigenous knowledge helped settlers survive, though relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples varied greatly across regions. Sometimes cooperation occurred. Other times, misunderstanding and conflict shaped the settlement process. These interactions influenced how colonies grew and how their economies formed. Over time, the settlements evolved into organized societies. Local councils emerged to handle disputes and manage shared resources. Port officials monitored trade. Farmers exchanged goods with traders. Craftsmen opened workshops. Schools educated children. Churches gathered communities. These routines gave the settlements stability and continuity. People no longer saw themselves merely as travelers or temporary residents. They saw themselves as members of new communities. The development of colonial economies further strengthened these settlements. In North America, agriculture, fishing, and timber industries grew rapidly. In the Caribbean, sugar and other crops became central. In India, textiles and spices shaped trade. Each region specialized in goods that could be exchanged within the global network Britain was creating. This specialization made the colonies important not only to Britain, but also to one another. A merchant in North America might import sugar from the Caribbean or cloth from India, making colonial life richer and more interconnected. Trade routes became predictable. Ships followed seasonal winds and currents. Maps improved, and navigation became more reliable. Ports were expanded to accommodate larger vessels. Dock workers, sailors, and merchants formed the working backbone of these growing economies. The movement of goods became steady, creating prosperity in some regions. As the colonies grew, so did Britain's sense of its place in the world. What began as isolated settlements had become valuable parts of a wider network. Britain saw itself not just as an island nation, but as a global presence. This identity developed slowly, shaped by the daily activities of settlers, traders, and administrators who connected distant lands through routine work. The colonies influenced Britain as much as Britain influenced them. New foods, materials, and ideas entered British society. Tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from America, and goods from Africa all became part of everyday life. British culture changed subtly as these global connections deepened. People increasingly discussed distant lands, learned about foreign customs, and recognized the growing importance of overseas territories. Yet the rise of colonies was not without challenges. Settlers faced hardships, storms, crop failures, disease, and conflict. Administrators struggled to manage distant territories. Communications were slow, taking months for messages to travel across oceans. Decisions made in London often arrived too late to address local problems. This distance sometimes created tension between colonial leaders and the British government. Still, the colonies continued to grow. They adapted to difficulties and moved forward. The global network strengthened as more connections formed. In time, colonies became stepping stones for further exploration. Ships from one colony sailed to another, expanding knowledge of the seas and coasts. Britain used its colonies as bases to reach new regions, making the global network even wider. One of the most significant developments was the creation of joint stock companies that operated across these territories. Investors in Britain funded trade and settlement activities, helping build infrastructure and expand influence. These companies connected business interests with colonial governance. Their activities shaped the economies of entire regions, turning settlements into organized economic centers.
The global network grew beyond economic links. Cultural exchange followed trade. People brought languages, customs, and ideas from one region to another. Colonial societies became diverse, blending European influences with local traditions. In India, British administrative practices mixed with local customs. In the Caribbean, African, European, and indigenous cultures blended to create unique identities. In North America, interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples shaped new cultural expressions. These cultural exchanges created hybrid societies that differed from both Britain and the regions they inhabited. As colonies matured, they began developing their own identities. People born in the colonies often saw themselves differently from those born in Britain. They maintained British ties, but also created local traditions, festivals, and community structures. This dual identity contributed to unique colonial cultures. These new identities later played important roles in historical events, including independence movements, but such developments were still far in the future during the early stages of settlement. The global network also created a sense of interdependence. Britain relied on its colonies for resources, trade, and manpower. Colonies relied on Britain for protection, manufactured goods, and economic guidance. This relationship was complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, but always connected. The rise of colonies shaped the political landscape of the time, influencing decisions made in Britain's parliament and affecting alliances with other European powers. By the 18th century, many colonial regions had become strong enough to support wider British ambitions. Ports in the Caribbean helped support naval activities. Settlements in North America became centers for raw materials. Cities in India became important administrative bases. African trading posts supported routes across the Atlantic. This network of settlements effectively created a global structure through which Britain could operate. The expansion of colonies also influenced global geography. Maps were updated with new coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges. Explorers used colonies as starting points for journeys into unexplored territories. Scientific knowledge grew as naturalists studied plants, animals, and climates across different continents. Colonies became places where knowledge was collected and shared, contributing to Britain's reputation as a center of learning and exploration.
The global network had long-term effects on the world economy. Goods that were once rare became widely available. Trade increased, connecting continents through regular routes. Markets grew, shaping consumer habits in both Britain and abroad. Colonial products became essential parts of everyday life. In many ways, the early colonies laid the foundation for modern global trade. As time passed, Britain's colonies were no longer isolated settlements. They had become functioning societies, contributing to a vast interconnected system. This system allowed Britain to influence world events, engage in large-scale trade, and expand its reach far beyond its geographic size. What started as simple settlements supported by trade evolved into a powerful network linking multiple continents.
This transformation was not quick or dramatic. It happened gradually, through years of steady effort, cooperation, adaptation, and routine. People built homes, farmed land, opened shops, sailed ships, kept records, and maintained relationships. Through these ordinary tasks, extraordinary connections formed. By the time the colonies were firmly established, Britain had become a global presence. Its settlements were no longer small dots on distant maps. They were essential parts of a system that moved goods, people, ideas, and influence across the world. They created a network that allowed Britain to expand further, shaping the next chapters of history. And thus, the colonies that began as simple settlements, fragile, uncertain, unplanned, slowly became pieces of a global network that redefined Britain's identity and the world's connections. This quiet, steady process helped create the foundations of the British Empire, which would continue to grow in complexity and scale in the centuries that followed.
The age of exploration was not a single moment in history, but a long, gradual process that reshaped the world in slow, steady waves. It was a time when ships became the bridges between continents, when maps expanded like unfolding stories, and when curious minds looked beyond familiar coastlines toward the unknown. Britain, like many European nations, entered this era step by step, guided by curiosity, necessity, and the gentle pull of distant horizons. Before exploration began in earnest, people's understanding of the world was limited. Maps were small, drawn with incomplete coastlines, imaginary creatures, and wide empty spaces labeled with guesses. Oceans were mysterious places, feared as much as they were admired. Most people lived their lives within the boundaries of landscapes they already knew. But as the centuries passed, technology improved and the desire for trade grew. The world slowly opened. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal and Spain led the earliest large-scale expeditions. Their sailors ventured into the Atlantic, rounding the coast of Africa and crossing the ocean to reach lands previously unknown to Europeans. When stories of these discoveries arrived in Britain, stories of spices, gold, new plants, new peoples, and vast coastlines, British merchants and rulers realized that the world was far larger and richer than they had imagined. Britain did not join immediately, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. Over time, Britain began sending explorers of its own. These early voyages were cautious and uncertain. Many of them were not intended to discover new continents, but to find faster trade routes, safer waters, and opportunities for commerce. Ships like the ones commanded by John Cabot in the late 15th century sailed westward in search of a northern passage to Asia. Instead, Cabot reached the coast of North America. His discovery did not create immediate colonies, but it opened Britain's eyes to the possibilities beyond the Atlantic. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, British explorers continued their journeys. They sailed up unfamiliar rivers, mapped new coastlines, and recorded their observations in journals.
These journals later became valuable sources of information. They described winds and currents, seasons and climates, plants and animals, and the customs of the peoples they met. Each journey added a small piece to the growing picture of the world. European maps changed accordingly. Coastlines that had once been drawn as rough curves became more precise. Unknown regions slowly filled with details. Oceans that were once blank spaces gained names and measurements. What used to be imagination gradually became knowledge. Mapmakers carefully redrew their charts, reflecting the discoveries of hundreds of voyages. The world was becoming connected through lines of ink on parchment. One of the important features of the age of exploration was navigation. Without reliable tools, long voyages were impossible. Early navigators depended on stars, the sun, and rudimentary compasses. As time passed, new instruments were introduced, such as the astrolabe and later the sextant, which helped sailors measure their position more accurately. Improvements in ship design also played a major role. Stronger hulls, better sails, and more efficient rigs allowed ships to travel longer distances with greater safety. Meanwhile, back in Britain, interest in exploration grew. Merchants sought new markets, rulers sought prestige, and ordinary people became fascinated by stories from across the sea. Books about distant lands circulated widely, filled with descriptions of countries many would never see. The world became a subject of imagination, inspiring more expeditions. Britain's involvement in the age of exploration was closely connected to its development as a maritime nation. Being an island meant that the sea was always near. Fishing, coastal trade, and shipbuilding were familiar activities. British sailors were already experienced, and the country's ports were well developed. When the opportunity arose to join global exploration, Britain was prepared. As voyages increased, so did the scale of discoveries. British explorers reached the coastlines of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Some of these journeys resulted in trade relationships. Others resulted in settlements that later grew into colonies. Many simply expanded knowledge without immediate consequences. But each voyage, successful or not, contributed to Britain's understanding of the wider world. One of the significant developments was the search for the Northwest Passage, a route through the northern waters of North America that would connect Europe to Asia. Explorers like Henry Hudson made multiple attempts to find this mythical passage. He sailed through icy waters, navigating dangerous conditions. Although the passage was not found during his lifetime, Hudson's journeys helped map the northeastern coast of the continent. His discoveries would later influence trade and settlement patterns. During this period, the idea of a connected world began to take shape. Goods flowed between continents. Explorers brought back plants like potatoes and tobacco, which became part of European life. Meanwhile, European goods reached distant regions, influencing local economies and cultures. The oceans were no longer barriers, they were pathways. Ships carried people, objects, and ideas across vast distances. Britain's interest in exploration reached its height in the 17th and 18th centuries. Companies such as the East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company sponsored expeditions, seeking new markets, resources, and opportunities. Their ships sailed regularly, connecting Britain to Asia, Africa, and America. Trade routes formed, becoming busier and more predictable. This increase in maritime activity paved the way for broader global influence. At the same time, scientific curiosity grew. Naturalists, astronomers, and geographers joined expeditions to study the natural world. Some voyages were organized specifically for scientific discovery. The most famous of these was led by Captain James Cook in the 18th century. Though Cook sailed slightly later than the earliest explorers, His journeys represent the culmination of the age of exploration. He charted the coast of New Zealand, explored Australia's eastern coastline, and traveled through the Pacific. His work significantly improved geographic knowledge, and the maps created from his voyages were remarkably accurate. Cook's voyages symbolized the shift from exploration driven by trade to exploration driven by science and understanding. His journals described local cultures, wildlife, weather patterns, and astronomical observations. These details enriched Europe's knowledge of the world and encouraged further learning. As maps were redrawn, people's perception of the world changed. The Earth felt smaller, not physically, but mentally. Distances remained the same, but the unknown became known. Regions once feared as mysterious became familiar through stories, drawings, and charts. Exploration connected distant places not only through trade, but also through shared understanding. Cultures began influencing each other, sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly. Ideas about government, religion, science, and art traveled across continents. But exploration also had consequences. Encounters between explorers and indigenous peoples were not always peaceful. Misunderstandings occurred, and conflicts sometimes followed. Diseases brought by Europeans had devastating effects on local populations in the Americas and elsewhere. These realities became part of the complex legacy of the age of exploration. Yet, in the early stages, many explorers were simply trying to understand new lands, record what they saw, and build connections through trade and communication. Despite these challenges, exploration continued. Each generation pushed a little farther. Ships sailed deeper into oceans that had once seemed endless. Coastlines were mapped with increasing precision. Journals documented landscapes, climates, and cultures previously unknown to Europeans. Bit by bit, the world's puzzle pieces came together. Back in Britain, ports flourished. London, Bristol, and Liverpool became major centers of global commerce. Shipyards grew busier. Dock workers, sailors, cartographers, and merchants became part of Britain's expanding maritime identity. Newspapers published accounts of new discoveries, fueling public curiosity. Schools and universities taught geography and navigation, reflecting the growing importance of global exploration.
The age of exploration created new forms of connection. Britain's colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia became part of a wider system of exchange. Goods moved from one region to another before reaching Europe. A box of tea from India might travel to a British settlement in the Caribbean, then to North America, and finally to London. These movements created interdependence among continents. At a deeper level, exploration shifted how people thought about themselves. Britain began to see its place in the world not as isolated, but as part of a global network. Its identity evolved from a small island nation to an influential maritime power. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, shaped by countless voyages, maps, negotiations, and scientific studies. One of the key outcomes of exploration was the creation of atlases. These books collected new knowledge into organized forms. Detailed maps showed coastlines, cities, deserts, mountains, and rivers from around the world. People who had never left Britain could now look at these maps and imagine distant places. The atlases connected minds across continents. At the same time, ocean crossings became less mysterious. Skilled navigators understood wind patterns, such as the trade winds and monsoons. They timed their voyages based on seasonal changes. This predictability made travel more efficient and less dangerous. Ships could carry more cargo and spend less time lost at sea. As the world became more connected, exploration shifted from discovery to expansion. Colonies grew,
trade networks expanded, and Britain, like other European powers, began using its geographic knowledge to strengthen its influence. But even as political and economic interests shaped decisions, the spirit of exploration continued. Scientists studied coral reefs, islands, and celestial events. Artists sketched landscapes and portraits of people they met. Linguists recorded new languages. Each expedition added not only economic value, but also cultural knowledge. By the 18th century, the age of exploration had achieved something remarkable. It made the world understandable. It connected oceans, lands, and people in ways that were unimaginable in earlier centuries. What had once been a world of separate regions became a world of shared maps and linked oceans. Britain's role in this transformation was significant. Though not the earliest to explore, Britain contributed to expanding geographic knowledge, redefining trade networks, and bridging continents. The journeys undertaken during this period laid the foundations for Britain's global presence and shaped the future of its empire. Yet the most lasting legacy of the age of exploration was knowledge itself. Maps became accurate, oceans became pathways instead of barriers. People began to think globally. The world, in all its vastness, became something that could be understood, even from the quiet comfort of a small island in the North Atlantic. And so, through centuries of voyages, observations, journals, and maps, the world became connected. Oceans that once separated people now linked them. The age of exploration turned curiosity into connection and reshaped the way humanity understood its place on Earth. It was a slow transformation, steady and continuous, like the tide that gradually changes a shoreline. But its impact would shape the centuries that followed, influencing trade, culture, science, and the rise of global networks that connected one settlement to another, one continent to another, and eventually one world to itself.
Life across the British Empire did not unfold in one single pattern. It moved in many directions at once, shaped by landscapes, climates, people, and traditions spread across continents. From small islands in the Caribbean to crowded cities in India, from quiet settlements in North America to trading posts along the coasts of Africa, millions of lives were connected by a network that grew gradually over centuries. This connection was not identical everywhere. It was a mixture of cooperation, adaptation, misunderstanding, exchange, and slow transformation. To understand this world, it helps to imagine the empire not as a single system, but as a vast collection of local worlds, each with its own rhythm, its own routines, and its own stories. Though Britain provided the link between them, each region shaped its own version of life under imperial influence. In India, daily life was rooted in traditions that stretched back thousands of years. Long before the British arrived, people lived within complex social, cultural, and religious systems. Families practiced rituals, communities followed ancient customs, and markets bustled with activity. When the British built settlements, they encountered this rich landscape. British officials, soldiers, and merchants lived in quarters near their factories and administrative centers. Their routines were often very different from local life. They kept diaries, held meetings, and followed the patterns of British society, from afternoon tea to formal dinners. Yet outside their compounds, Indian life continued in its own rhythm. Over time, the two worlds interacted. Indian craftsmen produced goods for British markets, British administrators learned local languages, Indian cooks prepared meals adapted to British tastes, while British goods, like textiles, tea sets, and paper, entered Indian homes. Hybrid forms of architecture appeared, mixing British styles with local designs. Stories traveled in both directions. Folk tales, songs, and customs gradually became known across cultural lines. Though the British presence affected daily life, Indian traditions remained strong, shaping the character of each region. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean,
life followed a different pattern. The islands were shaped by agriculture, especially sugar plantations. British settlers lived in houses near their estates, overseeing work and managing trade. Local communities were formed from a blend of cultures: indigenous people, Africans brought through the Atlantic trade system, and Europeans who settled on the islands. This mix created new languages, foods, music, and social customs. The climate influenced everything. Warm winds blew through fields, and plantations became central to life. Markets in coastal towns sold fruits, spices, and goods shipped from Britain. Ships arrived regularly, creating a connection between island ports and distant markets. Despite hardships, communities developed their own vibrant traditions, festivals, storytelling, and shared cultural practices that blended different backgrounds into a unique island identity.
In North America, life in the colonies evolved steadily. Early settlements were simple, but as towns grew, daily routines became more structured. Families farmed land, built houses, and formed communities based on shared beliefs. Town meetings were common, and people worked together during harvest seasons. British influence appeared in architecture, clothing, and laws. Meanwhile, indigenous societies continued living according to their ancestral traditions. Their interactions with settlers varied, from trade and cooperation to conflict and resistance. Cultural exchange was constant. Indigenous knowledge of farming, hunting, and navigation helped settlers survive early hardships. In return, European tools, goods, and customs entered indigenous communities. Over generations, some regions developed blended traditions, while others remained culturally distinct. In Africa, life around British trading posts reflected a balance between local customs and foreign influence. Merchants and local leaders negotiated daily. Markets were busy with goods moving in and out of coastal towns. People maintained traditional lifestyles, farming, fishing, crafting, and participating in community rituals, while also engaging with European traders. Languages mixed, producing new forms of communication used in ports and trading centers. Across all these regions, one thing was consistent: local life shaped British presence more than British presence shaped local life. Though Britain brought goods, laws, and administrative structures, the everyday routines of millions of people continued according to familiar patterns. The empire's influence was often strongest in ports, towns, and administrative hubs, while rural life remained deeply rooted in local tradition. Yet the empire created connections that slowly intertwined lives across continents. Consider the journey of a simple object, like a piece of cloth. A weaver in India might create a textile using skills passed down for generations. That cloth would be purchased by a merchant working with the East India Company. It would then travel by ship to a port in Britain, where it might be sold in a London market. From there, it could be shipped again to the Caribbean or North America, becoming part of someone's household thousands of miles away. In this way, local craftsmanship in one region became part of daily life in another. Food created another set of connections. Tea from China and India filled cups in Britain. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened those cups. Spices from Asia flavored meals in European kitchens. Meanwhile, British foods like flour, salted meat, and preserved vegetables traveled to distant colonies, shaping diets in places far from their origin. These exchanges created a world where distant cultures were tied together by everyday objects. Stories also traveled. Sailors carried tales from port to port. Letters moved between continents, describing new landscapes, unfamiliar customs, and experiences in faraway lands. Missionaries wrote journals documenting the people they met. Scholars exchanged ideas across borders. Over time, these stories blended into a global understanding, one shaped by curiosity, interpretation,
and sometimes misunderstanding. In colonies with large British communities, a unique lifestyle developed. Officials lived in large houses, often built with local materials but designed in British style. They hosted gatherings, celebrated British holidays, and tried to recreate aspects of home. But they also adapted to the climate and culture around them, wearing lighter clothing, using local foods, and observing regional traditions. This blend created a way of life that was neither fully British nor fully local, but something in between. For local populations living under British rule or influence, life varied greatly. In some regions, British presence offered trade opportunities, employment, and access to new goods. In others, it brought challenges, including changes to traditional governance, economic pressure, or cultural disruption. Many communities adapted by blending old and new practices. Others resisted foreign rule or maintained their own customs independently. Education gradually became a point of exchange. Missionaries and colonial administrators introduced schools in some regions. Local children learned English, mathematics, and Western history, while still maintaining ties to their own languages and cultures. Some families embraced these opportunities, hoping for economic advantages. Others preferred to preserve traditional forms of knowledge. The result was a layered educational landscape shaped by multiple influences. Religion also created connections. British officials and missionaries introduced Christianity to various colonies. In some places, it blended with local beliefs, creating unique spiritual traditions. In others, long-standing religions, such as Hinduism, Islam, and indigenous faiths, continued to guide daily life. This coexistence formed complex cultural landscapes where different beliefs interacted. Another layer of connection came from travel. British officers, merchants, and workers moved between colonies, carrying experiences from one place to another. An administrator who lived in India might later work in the Caribbean. A soldier serving in Africa might later be stationed in Canada. Each transfer brought stories, habits, and perspectives that shaped interactions in new places. This movement helped form invisible threads linking distant lands.
In cities like Calcutta, Kingston, Boston, and Cape Town, daily life became a mixture of cultures. Markets sold British goods alongside local produce. Churches stood next to temples and mosques. Streets echoed with multiple languages. Fabrics, foods, and festivals reflected blended influences. These cities became global microcosms, places where the empire's connections were visible in everyday routines. At the same time, rural areas remained more traditional. Farmers worked the land as their ancestors had. Communities held ceremonies tied to local histories. Music, art, and storytelling preserved cultural memory. Even when British influence touched these regions, local identity remained strong. The empire did not erase these traditions. Instead, it existed alongside them, forming a layered world where old and new coexisted. Over generations, people born in colonies developed their own identities. They were connected to Britain through language, culture, and administration, yet deeply rooted in their local environment. Their worldview was shaped by both global networks and local traditions. This dual identity contributed to a rich diversity that defined life in colonial societies. Communication between colonies and Britain was slow but constant. Letters took months to cross oceans. Reports were written carefully by administrators. Newspapers circulated stories about distant lands. These exchanges created a sense of belonging to a larger world, even if that world was experienced differently depending on one's location. Another aspect of life across the empire was adaptation. British settlers adapted to local food, climate, and customs. Local populations adapted to new goods, technologies, and administrative systems. These adaptations happened gradually, often without formal planning. People adjusted routines, learned new skills, and blended practices into daily life. The empire also shaped global time. Ships traveled according to seasonal winds, creating predictable patterns. Harvests in one region influenced markets in another. The arrival of goods created rhythms that connected continents. A farmer harvesting cotton in India influenced a factory in Britain. A sugar crop in the Caribbean affected markets in London. These economic rhythms shaped daily life across the empire, even for people who never left their hometowns. Despite these global connections, the empire remained uneven. Some regions prospered, others faced hardship. Local experiences varied widely. But in all places, the combination of cultures created new stories. Stories of cooperation, conflict, adaptation, resistance, curiosity, and everyday life. These stories formed the human side of an empire that was too large for any one person to fully understand.
By the 19th century, the British Empire had become a vast network of lands and peoples. Yet life within this network remained grounded in local realities. A farmer in India, a worker in a Caribbean port, a settler in North America, and an official in Africa each lived their own version of empire. Their stories intertwined not through direct contact, but through shared systems of trade, administration, and cultural influence. The empire's greatest impact may have been the connections it created, connections that allowed plants, goods, languages, and stories to travel between regions. These connections were often slow and subtle, shaped by ordinary activities rather than dramatic events. Through these small interactions, the empire gradually linked distant cultures. Today, many of the world's cultural blends, foods, languages, music, and customs can be traced to this era of intertwined lives. The connections formed across continents did not end with the empire. They continued influencing future generations. And so, life across the empire was not a single story. It was millions of stories happening at once. Some were peaceful, some challenging, some filled with hope, others marked by hardship. Together, they created a tapestry of human experience shaped by the movement of ideas, goods, and people across oceans. In this calm, slow unfolding of daily life, markets opening, ships arriving, letters traveling, families adapting, traditions blending, the empire took shape not just through borders or administration, but through the intertwined stories of the people who lived within it. Across its vast reach, the British Empire experienced many moments of challenge, some large, some small, many quiet, and many slow in unfolding. These challenges did not always appear as sudden shocks or dramatic battles. More often, they developed gently, like distant waves building strength before reaching the shore. They tested the empire's stability, its systems, its relationships, and its ability to adapt. Understanding these calm conflicts helps reveal how the empire changed over time, sometimes adjusting peacefully, sometimes struggling silently beneath the weight of its own expansion. Life inside the empire was busy and complex. Ships carried goods across seas, officials managed distant provinces, merchants negotiated in crowded markets, and local communities navigated new realities. But beneath this activity, deeper issues were forming, issues of governance, culture, economics, and identity. These quiet tensions often became the early signs of future challenges. One of the first major challenges appeared in North America. British settlers had formed strong communities over generations. They built towns, farmed land, and developed their own systems of local governance. Over time, these colonies grew confident and self-reliant. They saw themselves as British, but they also saw themselves as something new, people shaped by the land they lived on, by new opportunities, and by a different way of life. This emerging identity created a gentle tension with the British government, which continued to impose taxes and laws from across the ocean. For many years, these tensions remained quiet.
Debates happened in meeting halls. Letters were exchanged politely. Colonists questioned, discussed, and negotiated. But gradually, the calm disagreements deepened. The people in North America felt their voices were not fully heard. Britain believed it was managing its colonies in a reasonable way. Two perspectives, both firm but polite at first, drifted apart. Eventually, the tension grew strong enough to spark open conflict. Yet even before the visible struggle began, the true conflict was internal, an early separation of identities that had quietly taken shape over decades. While North America moved toward independence, Britain faced different challenges in India. The East India Company had become the major governing authority, but its administration was far from perfect. Company officials earned profits, managed revenue, and maintained armies. But this rapid expansion brought confusion, corruption, and inequality. The company's policies often disrupted local economies, placing pressure on farmers, traders, and communities.
At the same time, India was home to diverse kingdoms, languages, religions, and traditions. These differences created delicate balances that required careful understanding. British administrators, unfamiliar with these complexities, sometimes made decisions that unintentionally caused tension. Policies about land, taxes, trade, and military organization affected millions of lives. Over many years, these quiet tensions built slowly, like rising heat beneath the surface. The first major expression of this pressure came in the form of local resistance. Some regions protested taxes, others questioned company rule. These were not always violent uprisings. Many were calm refusals, petitions, or appeals to traditional leaders. For a long time, such resistance remained small and contained. But as pressure continued, it eventually contributed to the larger conflict of 1857, a turning point that reshaped Britain's relationship with India. Even before open conflict, the signs were there: distrust, miscommunication, cultural misunderstanding, and everyday frustrations. These early moments were calm but important. They revealed that the empire's structures were not as stable as they appeared from the outside. Beyond political challenges, the empire also faced natural and social pressures. Famines, droughts, and economic downturns affected regions differently. In some places, harvest failures pushed communities into hardship. British administrators tried to respond, but distance, limited resources, and unfamiliarity with local needs often slowed their actions. These delays caused quiet suffering and created long-lasting memories in the minds of affected communities. In the Caribbean, the plantation economy brought economic success to Britain, but created deep social challenges. The system was built on forced labor, which created inequality and hardship. Over time, local populations developed their own cultural strength and demanded dignity, rights, and recognition. Their resistance did not always involve confrontation. Sometimes it took the form of cultural expression, songs, stories, gatherings, and shared beliefs that helped maintain identity. In other moments, it took the form of petitions, peaceful protests, and negotiations. These calm acts of resilience eventually contributed to larger movements for freedom and equality. In Africa, British trading posts and settlements interacted with powerful local kingdoms. These relationships required careful diplomacy. Chiefs and kings expected respect and clear communication. Britain expected smooth trade and cooperation. When misunderstandings occurred, conflict sometimes followed. But many of these conflicts were small, brief disagreements over trade terms, border lines, or local customs. These were resolved through dialogue, gifts, or adjustments in policy. They were quiet moments that seldom made headlines, but shaped the long-term relationship between Britain and African communities. Another challenge emerged from distance itself. The empire was large, stretching across oceans and continents. Communication was slow. Decisions made in London often took months to reach distant colonies.
By the time instructions arrived, local realities had already changed. Governors and officials had to use their own judgment, sometimes making choices that differed from what Britain expected. This gap between intention and action created a calm but constant conflict, administrative tension.
Officials in faraway provinces faced local problems that London could not see. Local leaders sometimes disagreed with British policies. Merchants found regulations difficult to follow. Communities wanted more autonomy. These issues did not always lead to rebellion, but they created quiet friction within the empire's machinery. Maintaining order required patience, negotiation, and adaptation. Cultural difference was another subtle challenge. People across the empire spoke different languages, followed different religions, and lived according to different customs. British administrators tried to understand these differences, but misunderstandings were inevitable. Cultural practices that were normal in one region seemed unfamiliar in another. British laws sometimes clashed with local traditions. Local communities adapted some British customs but resisted others. These everyday interactions were among the calmest conflicts, neither violent nor dramatic, but persistent and emotionally significant. In regions like Australia and New Zealand, British settlers arrived in lands long inhabited by indigenous peoples with rich histories and spiritual connections to the land. Early interactions were sometimes peaceful, exchanges of tools, food, or knowledge, but differences in land use, ownership, and settlement practices gradually created tension. Indigenous communities faced disruptions to their way of life. These conflicts often unfolded slowly through legal disputes, changes in land access, or forced movement. Though they were calm on the surface, they deeply reshaped communities. Economic pressures added another layer of challenge. The empire depended on global trade, and global trade depended on stability. When markets shifted in Europe, colonies felt the impact. When colonies faced shortages, Britain felt pressure to respond. Economic crises, though often quiet, tested the empire's strength. Administrators balanced budgets, merchants adjusted prices, and families changed their daily routines. These calm adjustments reflected the hidden challenge of maintaining such a large global system. One little-noticed conflict involved knowledge and communication. As the empire grew, new information traveled back to Britain: maps, observations, reports, and statistics. Some of this information was misunderstood or incomplete. Decisions were sometimes based on limited understanding. This created quiet misunderstandings between Britain and its colonies. British intentions were not always clear locally, and colonial concerns were not always clear in London. These gaps in understanding rarely led to sudden conflict, but shaped the slow erosion of trust in various regions.
Another challenge came from Britain's rivals. Other European powers, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and later Germany, also built empires. They competed for trade routes, settlements, and influence. Though major wars did occur, many of these conflicts were quiet. They happened through diplomacy, trade restrictions, naval presence, or negotiations over borders. Sometimes two empires would disagree over a small island or a section of coastline. These disputes were settled through talks, treaties, or small military actions. They did not always make loud headlines, but they influenced the map of the world. Throughout these challenges, the British Empire relied on adaptation. Officials learned from past mistakes, policies were adjusted, trade regulations were updated, local leaders were consulted, education systems slowly expanded, cultural exchanges increased. In many cases, peaceful adjustment prevented larger conflicts. These calm responses kept the empire functioning for generations. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper challenge was forming: the desire for self-governance.
Over time, many colonies developed their own identities. They built schools, businesses, and communities. They sent representatives to councils. They saw themselves not simply as subjects of Britain, but as nations in the making. This shift did not happen suddenly. It happened slowly, through conversations, teachings, books, newspapers, and daily experiences. In some regions, this desire for autonomy grew quietly until it became strong enough to demand recognition. These movements began with words, petitions, meetings, and peaceful organization. Only later, in certain regions, did they transform into larger political actions. Britain faced the challenge of responding to these aspirations, balancing its own authority with the growing confidence of its colonies. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the empire's calm conflicts had accumulated. Social changes, economic pressures, cultural interactions, and local political movements created a complex environment. Britain tried to maintain unity through reforms, dialogues, and adjustments. Some measures worked, others did not. The empire continued, but its foundations were shifting. Despite all these challenges, the empire held together for a long time because many of the conflicts were quiet, slow, and manageable. People adapted, administrators negotiated, communities found space to maintain their traditions, trade continued, relationships evolved. The empire did not fall in a single moment. It gradually transformed into a commonwealth of nations, each following its own path, shaped by its own history. Many of the calm conflicts of earlier centuries became the seeds of independence movements. Many of the challenges became lessons for future generations. Looking back, the history of these challenges shows that global power is not tested only by major wars or dramatic battles. It is also tested by quiet disagreements, cultural differences, administrative difficulties, and the slow rise of new identities. These are the conflicts that move silently through daily life, shaping decisions, influencing policies, and preparing the ground for change. The British Empire faced countless such moments. Some were resolved peacefully. Others left lasting marks. Together, they formed the hidden story of an empire learning to navigate a world filled with complexity, diversity, and slow but steady transformation. And so, the challenges and calm conflicts that tested this global power were not always loud or visible. Many were soft, subtle, and spread across years, shaping the empire gently, like quiet winds shaping dunes over time. The British Empire did not collapse suddenly. It did not fall with a single battle, a single moment, or a single decision. Instead, it slowly loosened over many decades, like the quiet fading of sunlight at the end of a long day. The change was gentle in some places, gradual in others, and almost invisible at times. But once the process began, it continued steadily, shaped by many factors: economic pressure, cultural awakening, political demands, global shifts, and the simple passage of time. To understand this long sunset, we must look back at the empire not as a mighty structure collapsing at once, but as a vast network gradually relaxing its hold. Throughout the 19th century, Britain's power reached its height. It controlled territories across every continent. Its navy patrolled seas, its companies managed trade, and its administrators governed millions of people. But even during this period of strength, quiet changes had already begun. These changes were small, barely noticeable at first, but they grew slowly and steadily. One of the earliest signs came from within Britain itself. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the country. Factories, machines, and new technologies created wealth, but they also created social and economic shifts. Britain needed raw materials, markets, and labor to keep its industries running. The empire provided these. But this dependency also meant that Britain needed stability across its colonies, something increasingly difficult to maintain as local societies evolved. In many colonies, new ideas were spreading. People were learning to read, forming organizations, and discussing rights, freedoms, and identity. These conversations were gentle at first, held in small groups, local meeting halls, or homes, but they planted the seeds of independence movements. As people became more aware of global events, they began to question their own position within the empire. The 19th century also brought social and cultural changes. Missionaries established schools. Local leaders traveled abroad for education. Newspapers circulated new ideas. Colonies became more connected to global currents of thought. People observed how nations in Europe governed themselves. They noticed that many British principles, freedom of speech, representation, fairness, were not always applied equally across the empire. These observations formed a quiet, steady pressure from within. Another sign of the coming sunset was the rise of nationalism. In India, educated communities began writing about the value of self-rule. In Africa, local leaders formed associations to protect their rights. In the Caribbean, people questioned economic systems and sought greater equality. In Ireland, demands for self-government grew stronger. In the Middle East, old empires were reshaping themselves, creating new identities. These movements did not begin violently. Most started with discussions, petitions, cultural pride, and the desire for recognition. Meanwhile, global dynamics were shifting. Other nations, such as the United States, Japan, and Germany, were rising in power. They built economies, expanded militaries, and challenged Britain's dominance in trade and diplomacy. Though Britain remained strong, it was no longer the only major power. Its influence began to face competition.
Then came the First World War. The war stretched across continents, drawing soldiers from many parts of the empire. Men from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada fought alongside British troops. They served with courage, traveled to distant battlefields, and witnessed the struggles of global conflict. Their participation created a subtle but powerful shift. Soldiers who fought for freedom abroad returned home with new expectations, expectations of respect, recognition, and rights. After the war, many regions expected reforms. They hoped for more representation, more autonomy, and more opportunities. Britain introduced some changes, but struggled to address the deeper desires of its colonies. Economic hardship after the war made things even more difficult. Britain faced debts, unemployment, and the need to rebuild. Its capacity to maintain tight control over distant territories weakened. During this period, independence movements grew stronger. In India, peaceful protests, writings, and meetings spread across cities and villages. Leaders spoke about self-rule, inspiring millions. In the Middle East, borders were redrawn, influencing political movements. Ireland moved toward separation. In Africa and the Caribbean, workers demanded better conditions and political representation. These movements did not always begin with confrontation. They often began with community gatherings, student discussions, and cultural pride. The Second World War accelerated the sunset even more. Britain once again relied heavily on its colonies for resources, soldiers, and support. The war drained Britain's economy and weakened its ability to govern a vast empire. At the same time, the war introduced new ideas about freedom and self-determination. World leaders spoke about the rights of nations to choose their own futures. These words resonated deeply across the empire. When the war ended, Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. Cities had been bombed, industries damaged, and finances stretched thin. The empire had become too large and too expensive to manage. At the same time, independence movements were stronger, more organized, and more confident than ever.
India was the first major region to gain independence after the war. The decision came through negotiations, discussions, and political planning, slow, thoughtful steps that represented the calm shift of global power. India's independence inspired many other regions. It showed that the empire could change peacefully. Over the next decades, one territory after another moved toward self-rule. In the Middle East, countries gained independence through treaties. In Africa, newly educated leaders formed political parties, negotiated constitutions, and prepared for nationhood. In the Caribbean, islands moved from local autonomy to full independence in stages. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, similar transitions unfolded. These were not sudden events. They often took years of discussion, planning, and step-by-step progress. Some transitions experienced tension, but many were peaceful. Communities prepared their own governments, wrote national laws, and shaped their identities. Britain, recognizing the direction of history, supported many of these transitions, helping train administrators, share governance systems, and establish new relationships. By the 1960s, the empire had transformed into something different, a group of independent nations connected by history, language, and cooperation. This new association became known as the Commonwealth. Unlike the empire, the Commonwealth was not based on control, it was based on partnership. Countries that had once been colonies now ruled themselves, but chose to maintain peaceful ties with Britain. This marked a gentle conclusion to centuries of global influence. As the empire faded, Britain also changed. It shifted from being an imperial power to being a modern nation focused on internal development. Its role in world politics became more collaborative. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange replaced territorial control.
Yet the sunset of the empire did not erase the past. The connections formed during centuries of global interaction continued to influence the world. Languages remained intertwined. Foods, customs, and traditions crossed borders. Diasporas created global communities. Former colonies maintained connections with Britain through education, travel, culture, and shared history. The long sunset of the British Empire was not the story of defeat. It was a gradual transformation, one shaped by changing ideas, global events, economic realities, and the desire of people around the world to shape their own futures. It was a peaceful conclusion to a system that had grown too large and too complex to continue in its old form. In many ways, the empire became unnecessary for the modern world. Communication improved, trade systems changed, nations gained confidence. Global cooperation became more important than control. And so, as the light of imperial rule faded, a new world emerged, one made of independent nations connected through choice rather than obligation. The sunset was long and gentle. It did not fall suddenly, nor did it cast harsh shadows. Like the end of a long day, it carried a quiet calm. One chapter closed, and another began.
When the British Empire finally settled into history, it did not disappear entirely. Its structures ended, its political reach faded, and its territories became independent nations. Yet its influence did not vanish. It remained woven into the daily rhythms of the modern world, quietly, subtly, and often unnoticed. What survives today is not the empire itself, but the traces it left behind in languages, cultures, institutions, and shared connections across continents. One of the most visible legacies is language. English, once the language of a small island in the North Atlantic, became a global medium of communication. Today, it is spoken in classrooms, offices, diplomatic meetings, and everyday conversations across dozens of countries. It did not spread everywhere in the same way, nor does it replace local languages, but it forms a common bridge between people who might otherwise have no way to speak to one another.
Another legacy appears in systems of governance. Many former colonies adopted parliamentary structures, legal frameworks, and administrative practices inspired by British models. Though each country reshaped these systems to suit its own identity, the foundations remain visible. Elections, courts, and civil services often reflect this shared heritage, creating similarities across countries that are geographically far apart. Education also carries the imprint of the empire. Schools and universities in many regions were shaped by British influences, curricula, subjects, and teaching styles that introduced literature, science, and global knowledge to generations of students. Over time, these institutions adapted to local cultures, but the underlying structure remained connected to earlier foundations. Cultural influence is another quiet trace. Foods, festivals, habits, and sports moved across borders through centuries of interaction. Cricket became popular in South Asia and the Caribbean. Tea became a daily ritual in many households around the world. Architectural styles, clothing, and even small traditions reflect these blended histories. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is connection itself. The empire created networks, some painful, some productive, that tied distant regions together. Today, these connections have transformed into modern relationships. Travel, migration, trade, and diplomacy between former colonies and Britain. Millions of families trace their roots across multiple continents. Cities like London, Toronto, Mumbai, Nairobi, and Sydney reflect this mix of cultures. The movement of people and ideas, once shaped by empire, now forms the basis of global society. Yet the legacy is not only positive. The empire also left behind difficult memories, inequalities, disruptions, conflicts, and losses that shaped nations in deep ways. These histories live alongside the achievements, creating a complex story. Modern countries continue to reflect on this past, studying it, questioning it, and learning from it. In place of the empire, a new community emerged, the Commonwealth. It is not a political authority, but a voluntary association of independent nations. Its purpose is dialogue, cooperation, and shared values rather than control. It represents how former relationships can transform into partnerships based on choice. Today, the empire exists only in history books, museums, and the memories of generations. What remains is a world transformed, connected in ways that began centuries ago, shaped by journeys, exchanges, and encounters across oceans. As the story closes, we see that the empire's legacy is neither simple nor uniform. It is a mixture of languages, systems, cultures, and global links. It is a reminder that history does not end when empires fall. It continues quietly through the choices people make, the stories they share, and the connections they carry forward.